The classroom buzzed with the usual energy of a college lecture hall. Students chatted, flipped through notebooks, and checked their phones. Among them sat Michael Johnson, a man in his early 30s. He wore a simple black t-shirt and jeans. His posture was straight, and he carried a calm, yet commanding presence. Unlike the younger students around him, Michael had seen things they could never imagine. He was a veteran, returning to school after serving in the military for over a decade. He had spent years in war zones, enduring hardships most people wouldn't believe. Now, he was here, hoping to rebuild his future with a degree. As the clock struck 10, the classroom door swung open. Professor Lisa Anderson entered. Her heels clicked against the tile floor. She was in her 40s, sharply dressed, and carried an air of authority that filled the room. She was known for her strict grading and no-nonsense attitude. But there was something else about her. She had little patience for students she thought didn't belong in higher education. She scanned the room, her eyes landing on Michael. A smirk tugged at the corner of her lips. Looks like we have a new student, she said, crossing her arms. And a much older one at that. The room fell silent. Some students exchanged awkward glances. Michael met her gaze, but said nothing. Professor Anderson chuckled. Well, I suppose it's never too late to learn, though I do hope you can keep up. This class isn't some remedial program. A few students snickered, while others looked uncomfortable. But Michael didn't flinch. He had faced worse than this. A condescending professor wasn't going to shake him. What Professor Anderson didn't realize was that Michael wasn't just there to learn. He was about to teach her a lesson she would never forget. As the class proceeded, Professor Anderson's sharp, condescending remarks continued. She often paused her lecture to glance at Michael, making comments about his unusual background, like his time in the military. One day, she remarked, "Isn't it nice that some of us get a little extra time to discover what we really want to do? Though, I'm sure someone like you," she glanced at Michael, "probably already knows exactly what he wants, right? After all, military life doesn't really leave room for personal growth." The class went silent again. Eyes darted between Michael and their professor. But Michael remained unfazed. He kept his focus on the lesson, not giving her the satisfaction of a reaction. Professor Anderson clearly wasn't used to being ignored. "Come on, Mr. Johnson," she continued, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Tell us what exactly you're hoping to get out of this degree. A career in some office job." Her words were sharp, like daggers aimed directly at him. A few students chuckled nervously, unsure how to react. It was clear the professor was trying to break him down. But Michael wasn't biting. Instead of responding to her taunts, Michael raised his hand. The room felt even quieter as everyone waited for him to speak. "Yes, Mr. Johnson?" Professor Anderson asked, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "I'm here to learn," he said simply. His response was calm, direct, and almost unremarkable. But it made something shift in the room. For a brief moment, even Professor Anderson's smug expression faltered. She cleared her throat, quickly moving on with the lecture, though her eyes never fully left him. She was irritated now. He wasn't responding the way she expected, but that wouldn't last. It wasn't long before Professor Anderson's mockery escalated. She would call on Michael during class, often in an attempt to embarrass him in front of the rest of the students. One afternoon, she asked a question about the political systems of different countries, something that was clearly a bit more difficult than usual. Students shuffled in their seats, flipping through notes as they tried to recall the information. When the silence grew too thick, Professor Anderson's eyes landed on Michael. "Johnson," she said sweetly, her voice far too pleasant, "why don't you share your thoughts on the differences between authoritarianism and democracy?" Michael had been listening carefully, but the question was difficult. Still, he knew the answer. He took a deep breath and began speaking. "Well, authoritarianism is a system where power is concentrated in the hands of one or a few individuals, and there's limited political freedom. Democracy, on the other hand, allows for the people to have a voice in government through free and fair elections." He spoke calmly, his voice steady. But as soon as he finished, Professor Anderson interrupted. Well, that was a very basic answer, Mr. Johnson," she said, her tone dripping with disdain. "For someone who's supposed to be an adult, I would have expected more depth." The students around him shifted uncomfortably. Michael's cheeks burned, but he refused to let her see any vulnerability. He just nodded, letting the moment pass. But that wasn't the worst of it. The following week, the class had a group project. As the groups were being assigned, Professor Anderson chose to pair Michael with a few of the younger students. She even made a comment as she handed out the groups. "I think the younger students might be able to teach Mr. Johnson a thing or two," she said. The whole class laughed in agreement. It stung, but Michael still said nothing. He wasn't here to argue with her or get caught up in her childish games. Yet, deep down, he knew the time for silence was coming to an end. The group project was a nightmare from the start. Michael's assigned group members, 3 younger students, didn't take him seriously. They ignored him during the planning stages, assuming he had no idea what he was doing. They whispered behind his back, making jokes about him. One of the students, a girl named Emily, rolled her eyes when he tried to offer input. "You're just here to make up the numbers, aren't you? You're probably used to following orders, not thinking for yourself," she sneered. Michael felt his patience fraying, but he said nothing. He knew that engaging with them would only make things worse. The project deadline loomed, and the tension grew. The group hadn't made much progress, and Michael's suggestions were being ignored more and more. Emily and her friends seemed content to let the project fail, knowing they could blame him when it did. The final straw came when they had to present their work. Michael's group was last. As they stood in front of the class, Emily, who had taken the lead, began speaking. She rambled through their findings, clearly unprepared. Michael could see Professor Anderson's sharp gaze flickering between the group and her notes, as though she was waiting for an excuse to rip them apart. When Emily finished, there was an awkward silence. Professor Anderson's eyes narrowed as she spoke. "Well, that was disappointing," she said, her voice cold, her words cutting like a knife. "You had one job, to show me you actually understand the material." She turned to Emily. "And you're the group leader. You should have done better." Emily shifted uncomfortably, but before she could respond, Michael spoke up. "Professor, if I may," he said, his voice steady and confident. The class fell silent as all eyes turned to him. Professor Anderson raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised that he was interrupting. "Yes, Mr. Johnson? I believe I should take responsibility for our failure," he said, his eyes locking onto the professor's. "But the truth is, we didn't fail because of a lack of effort from any one person. It's because we weren't allowed to work together as a team. And that's something I should have said earlier." For a moment, there was a long, uncomfortable silence. Emily's face flushed with embarrassment. Professor Anderson's eyes flickered with irritation, but Michael wasn't finished. "I may not be as young as the rest of you," he continued, his voice growing stronger, "but I've learned how to fight through much worse than this. And I won't let anyone treat me like I'm some sort of joke." The room was still. The tension was palpable. Professor Anderson opened her mouth to respond, but closed it again, clearly unsure of what to say. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. This time, her voice was quieter, less mocking. "Johnson, I'll take your point into consideration," she said, her tone much less confident than before. For the first time, she wasn't speaking down to him. The days following the presentation were a strange kind of quiet. The atmosphere in the classroom had shifted. Michael could feel the change, not just in the way Professor Anderson addressed him, but in the way the other students looked at him. There was a new respect, even if unspoken, that lingered in the air. Professor Anderson, however, was not one to admit defeat easily. Still, Michael noticed something was different. She wasn't mocking him anymore. Her remarks, though still sharp, had lost some of their edge. The playful sarcasm had been replaced by a more neutral tone. It all came to a head during the next exam. The class was taking a difficult test, one that would determine a large portion of their final grade. As the papers were handed out, Michael sat back in his seat, steady and calm. Professor Anderson began her usual rounds, walking between the rows, glancing at students as they worked. When she passed Michael, she stopped briefly, her eyes scanning his test paper. "Mr. Johnson," she said, her voice soft yet pointed, "I trust you're doing well." Michael looked up at her, surprised by the lack of mockery in her tone. "Yes, Professor, I am." She studied him for a moment longer before nodding and walking away. It was a small moment, but to Michael, it felt like a victory. He could sense that something had shifted in her, something subtle but important. When the exam was over, the class filed out one by one. Michael waited until the last of the students had left before he packed his things. As he made his way to the door, he was surprised to find Professor Anderson standing there, waiting for him. "Mr. Johnson," she began, her voice quieter than usual, "I need to apologize for the way I treated you. You were right about the project. I underestimated you, and I shouldn't have." Michael's heart skipped a beat. He had never expected an apology, especially not from someone like her. But there it was, hanging in the air between them, genuine and unforced. "First, I understand that my behavior was wrong," she continued. "And I respect your dedication. I've seen it now. It's clear you have more to offer than I gave you credit for." For a moment, neither of them spoke. It wasn't an easy thing to hear from a woman like Professor Anderson, who prided herself on being in control. But there was something raw in her admission, something that spoke to a deeper understanding of respect and growth. "I appreciate that, Professor," Michael replied, his voice steady. "I just want a chance to show I can do this." The brief silence was interrupted by the sound of the door opening. A few students lingered in the hallway, but in that moment, Michael and Professor Anderson were the only two in the room. "You're not just here to learn, Mr. Johnson," she said, her voice softening. "You're here to teach all of us a lesson in resilience. And I'm grateful for that." Michael nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "I think we both learned something today." With that, he walked out of the room, his head held a little higher than before. The semester neared its end, and with it, the final exam. Michael had been studying diligently, poring over his notes, revisiting his textbooks, and practicing every topic the professor had covered. He knew this exam could make or break his grade, but he wasn't worried. For the first time in a long while, he felt confident. The tension of the past few months, the ridicule, the isolation, had all faded into the background. It was just him and the work now. Professor Anderson, for her part, had maintained a quiet professionalism in the final weeks of class. There were no more jabs or mocking remarks. In fact, she seemed almost human. She greeted him with a nod of recognition each time their paths crossed. The morning of the final exam, Michael arrived early, hoping to review one last time. He sat at a desk in the back, his eyes skimming over the notes in front of him. The room was quiet, save for the soft rustle of paper as other students arrived. When the bell rang, signaling the start of the exam, Professor Anderson entered. She was holding a stack of test papers in her hands, her gaze sweeping the room. She seemed more composed than ever, but there was a hint of something in her eyes, something almost apologetic. She handed out the test papers with a sharp, professional motion. As she did, she paused in front of Michael's desk for a brief moment. Their eyes locked. "You've come a long way," she said softly, almost as if she was speaking to herself. Michael didn't respond. He didn't need to. He knew the journey he had taken wasn't just about acing an exam. It was about proving himself, not to her, not to the class, but to himself. The exam lasted 2 hours. During that time, Michael worked with an intensity that reflected all the struggles he had faced. He focused on each question carefully, weighing his answers. His mind, once clouded by doubt and the professor's sharp words, was now clear. The work came naturally. When the test was over, Michael turned it in without hesitation. His heart was steady. Professor Anderson gave him a quick nod as she accepted his paper, but there was no comment. Over the next few days, the class awaited their final grades. The atmosphere in the room had shifted completely. Professor Anderson's usual air of control seemed less rigid. She was more subdued now, more introspective. Then the moment arrived. The grades were posted on the bulletin board. Michael stood in front of the list, his stomach tightening as he scanned the page. He found his name, then his grade, and smiled. He had done it. But there was more. As he stood there, he noticed something odd. Professor Anderson's grade, the one she had posted next to the others, was not just a mirror image of the others. It was a note, a personal one. "Michael, more than just your academic ability, you've reminded me of something important. That resilience and respect go a long way. Keep moving forward. Professor Anderson." Michael stood there for a moment, taking in the words. It wasn't just a grade. It was an acknowledgement. For the first time, he felt like he truly belonged. The last day of class was bittersweet for Michael. The semester had ended, and as the students gathered their things and prepared to leave, there was an air of finality in the room. He felt a sense of accomplishment. His grade, the professor's apology, and the quiet respect from his classmates all affirmed that he had made it through the hardest part. But it wasn't just about the class. It was about everything he had overcome to get to this point. His military service, the scars, both visible and invisible, that he carried with him, and the challenges of returning to civilian life. Each of those things had shaped him, but they didn't define him. As the class slowly filtered out of the room, Michael remained at his desk for a moment longer. He was gathering his things when Professor Anderson approached him. "Mr. Johnson," she said, her voice quieter than usual, "may I speak with you for a moment?" He nodded, standing up and facing her. There was no sarcasm in her tone now, just sincerity. "First off, I want to apologize again for everything," she began. "I've been teaching for years, and I thought I knew everything about what makes a good student. But you've reminded me that sometimes it's not about the grades or the degree. It's about the strength and perseverance to keep going, no matter the odds." Michael felt his chest tighten slightly. He wasn't one to accept praise easily, especially from someone who had been so dismissive of him in the past. But the way she was speaking now, he could tell it was coming from a genuine place. "You didn't just pass my class, Mr. Johnson," she continued. "You taught me something I needed to learn myself." For a moment, the room was still. Michael didn't know how to respond. He wasn't used to this kind of recognition. "You've shown me what real strength looks like," Professor Anderson finished. "And for that, I'm truly grateful." Michael didn't say anything at first. He just nodded, letting the words settle in his mind. As he walked out of the classroom for the last time, he realized something. The journey he had started wasn't just about education. It had been about reclaiming his own sense of self-worth. The military might have trained him to survive, but school had taught him how to grow. He had come back to this classroom to prove he could do it. And now he knew he had. With his head held high, Michael stepped out into the world, ready for whatever came next. Thank you so much for following Michael's incredible journey in this story. His resilience, strength, and ability to overcome challenges serve as a reminder that we can all rise above the obstacles in our lives, no matter how hard they may seem. If this story inspired you or gave you chills, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with your friends and family. And if you want more powerful and emotional stories like this one, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. We'd also love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below about this story, and if you enjoyed this story, give it a big thumbs up. Your support helps us continue sharing stories that touch hearts and inspire change. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next story.